Hi, everyone. I'm Lakshmi Prathuri, and I'm truly thrilled today to have a conversation with Ajay Chowdhury. And instead of giving a long bio who he is, you'll find out more about who he is through our conversation. As most of you know, I always call myself a people collector because you get to meet some of the most amazing people. And when you can get into their minds and understand who they are, we all learn a lot. So today, let's get into the mind of Ajay Chowdhury, who wears many, many hats, and you'll find out soon. Welcome, Ajay.
Hey, Lakshmi, glad to see you. Very, very delighted to be in your collection.
Yes. Um, Ajay, I thought we should start with your avatar. There is many avatars you have. There's very, very few people I meet who are extremely comfortable in diverse situations. I mean, you worked in a large company and also been an entrepreneur. You've been, mentor to many startups, and you yourself are a writer and a theater persona, all sorts of things. We'll find out all about them. But the first thing I would love for you to talk about is it takes a very different persona to be comfortable in a large corporate setting where there is Fortune 500 companies and all that stuff. And as part of BCG Digital Ventures, you will be working with many, many large companies. And also, you've been with startups, be it supporting Shazam or starting your own. And it's a very different mindset. So tell me a little bit about the role you played in both sides, and what was your major learning from each that contributed toward you being an entrepreneur?
That's a great question. I think the common thread that probably goes through everything I do is building things. So the thing I always like to do is build something. There's no better feeling in the world than working with the team and saying, we've created something, and then looking back 4 or 5 years later and saying that thing would not have existed if we hadn't done it. And that's the common thread that runs through everything. So when I work with corporates, the work I'm doing with corporates is about helping them create new businesses. And a lot of the businesses that we come up with is stuff that wouldn't have existed before. The same thing when I'm working with startups. Same thing in theater. When we put on a play, you then look back on it and say, that's incredible. This thing wasn't there before. And then exactly the same thing for writing a book. So that common thread runs all the way through. Now, how you execute on it is somewhat different every single time. But that spark of creating something new is what really keeps me going through all of this. And I think I get bored very easily. So I like jumping from, from one place to another.
And just to continue on that, it's really managing people, right? And you deal with very, very different types of people. Somebody who's very used to structure versus someone who thrives on creativity. So tell me a little bit about how you manage very, very different people.
So again, I think the critical thing there is to begin to find the bits that you have in common with them. I'm very much a strangely bifurcated person. So I hope I'm pretty creative and I've got that creative gene inside me. But I also do love structure. I also do love things to be logical. And I think for me, it's really beginning to suss out when I'm starting to work with someone, what kind of person are they? And then the bit of me that relates most to them probably comes out more based on that. So when I'm dealing with my friend Vinita, it is very much on the creative side of things, having a great conversation about new things we can develop, et cetera, et cetera. All the creators, Vinita's a great businesswoman as well. But if I'm dealing with some of my colleagues at work right now in BCG, who are much, much more structured, et cetera, with them, it's very much about the process. How are we going to get there? What's the outcome going to be? And one just has to kind of adjust between those two. But the basic thing of really trying to connect with the person is what's really critical over here. And beginning to show that EQ in whichever circumstance you're in is something that I'm certainly trying to do.
I did my business school with a minor in theater arts, and I used to tell my professor that I learned more about dealing with people from my theater than I do from my business, because it's all about how to make the other person successful.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about, I mean, you've done a lot in theater. I mean, you co-founded Enact with Vinita, you did Rent a Space in London, and I'm sure as a student, you did a bunch of things in theater. How did your training in theater help you to be a better business person, and vice versa? How being good in business helped you be a better entrepreneur?
And another great question. The theater training has helped me tremendously. I studied initially to be an actor and realized that there were not that many roles for short Indian guys, so I decided to put that to one side. I wasn't a great actor either, and then I kind of moved into the directing world. But as a theater director and being on stage, you have to really figure out what is the essence of what I'm trying to say over here. What is the essence of what I'm trying to communicate over here? And once you've got that essence, trying to communicate it as effectively and efficiently as possible to make the other person seem something. And communication is at the core of any business that we do as well. I mean, it's a cliche, but it is absolutely true. And I think the communication tools that I learned in theater, I was able to bring to business. So at BCG as well, for instance, I run a whole thing on theater games, where I bring my BCG colleagues together and make them do very, very silly theater games, where the first couple of times, the first couple of games they play, they're kind of very befuddled about, well, why on earth am I doing this? But as they get into it, the trick of it really is, how do you get that logical mind that you have broken to begin to think about something that it wouldn't normally think about? In theater, that's where I think the biggest inspiration comes from, when something totally out of the blue, the actor says something totally out of the blue, and you realize that's really true. And I didn't see that coming. In business as well, particularly nowadays, when the business world and the tech world and the startup world is changing so dramatically, having that ability, to think differently is really, really key. One of my favorite games that I play, it's a really simple game, is asking, and if you can imagine 25 management consultants doing this, asking people to wander around the room and point at something and say what it is not. Now, you'd think this is really easy thing to do. I'm sitting in this room and I can point at this and say that's a horse, or that's a table. Interestingly, people find it very difficult, and as they start doing it, they start suddenly finding patterns. So they'll go, that's a horse, that's a dog, that's a sheep. No. Think about something completely different. And why your mind is so trained not to think of the billions of things something is not is really interesting. And when they break through that, suddenly some kind of magic begins to happen. So that training from theater to business has been really useful. And the other way around as well has been very helpful, because unfortunately, theater is a pretty precarious business. It's a precarious profession. And running a theater company is not the easiest thing in the world to make sure that you don't go bust. During COVID, unfortunately, so many companies have struggled. And that business hat was really helpful for running my company as well, because I could think of how to do that. So that cross-fertilization has been fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Now, in that game that you talked about, when you can think of what something is not, what skill is it giving you? Is it the ability to think without borders, or what is it that it's, like when you say a horse, but what it's not is, it's not a table, it's not a, but you can say it could be a table because you can put something on top of horse or whatever,
But that's exactly right. It's those creative skills that it's giving you. So when you then begin to think from a startup, so what we do is a lot of beginning to ideate around new business ideas for our clients. Now, if you go down the obvious route, somebody will have thought of that already. The really interesting business ideas come up when someone goes down a somewhat non-obvious route, or finds a new way to do something that people had always thought has to be done in this particular way. And that's a muscle that I think can be trained. Some people just say, oh, I'm not at all creative. I don't think that's true. When I work with a lot of my colleagues, a lot of them say, oh, I'm not really creative. I'm very much an accounting kind of person.
Yeah.
I think everybody can be creative if they want to be.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree. I think it's a muscle you need to exercise as opposed to an inborn talent.
Exactly.
And actually continuing on that, it's interesting. You said you wanted to be an actor. Then you said, hey, I'm better off as a director or a producer, or, there's so many other things that are there. One of the things I always think about is within us, always there's a struggle of being an individual versus building a platform, right?
Mhm.
So it's sort of when you're on stage and you're acting or whatever, it's just, forget even other people's eyes on you. It's all
Mhm.
about your effort, and that's it. And but when you're building a platform, A, you're dependent on many, many people, but B, the impact is also depends on you being able to motivate many different people. So I wanted to talk about the difference between being an artist versus being an entrepreneur where you're building a platform. So when do you say, hey, this is more important than that? Because it's difficult to do both all the time. So how do
Yeah,
you
no,
decide?
it is very difficult. I think the most difficult piece of being a theater director, for instance, is, at 8 p.m., when that curtain goes up, you've lost all control over this baby that you've been nurturing, for weeks or months, or years, if you've been thinking about it for years. It is now in the hands of somebody else. You've kind of handed it over, and what they do will determine what the audience thinks about it. That's a very humbling thing. And that requires an incredible amount of trust in other people. And I think that trust, again, back to whether it's a business context or an context, is really, really important. Because unless you've built that trust with the group of actors you're working with, you're never going to feel satisfied with what they've done. And unless you're then open to, if they take it in a different direction, saying, actually, that does work, that's fine too. And when I was running my startups, the most important thing for me, and it is again a cliche, is having the right team around me, of knowing what are my strengths, knowing who are the people who can complement me, with the stuff that I'm not particularly good at, and making sure we can trust each other. So she'll trust me to do my job and I'll trust her to do her job, is really, really critical. So that piece I find very powerful. Then as an artist, again, you're actually completely dependent on other people. So I've written 3 books now,
Right.
and initially when I started writing, I thought, okay, this is very much a solo pursuit. The writer is the person who sits alone in the garret, on a computer, bashes it all out, and that's it. It's a solo thing that they do. That's not at all the case. I mean, the first draft of what I did was the solo thing, but then the relationship between me and my editor was incredibly powerful, where she made my book. It's a book called The Waiter. My first book was a children's book. The second book was a
Yeah.
detective story. She made The Waiter so much better
Yeah.
than what I had originally written, because that sparking off each other and her saying something and me saying, that's such a good idea. What if I did this, is very, very powerful. And then even once the book was written, the relationship between me and the marketing people and me and the publicist for then marketing the book is equally important, because they're the people who get people to read it. So I don't think there is any such thing as a solo artist. I think every artist is part of an ecosystem that they have to absolutely collaborate with to be successful. So I think
Yeah.
everyone is part of a platform.
That's true. And yet there is a different role you play in, being from the behind the scenes person versus,
Sure.
in front. So I'd love to tell you the story of, I'll tell you one thing that when you have a teenage son, which I do, it's very hard to be a cool mom because no matter what you do, you're not cool enough. But if I can tell him that I spoke to someone today who was involved in Shazam, I think my cool factor is going to truly, truly go up. So thanks to you for that.
That's very kind. That's
So
very
I
kind.
wanted to ask you, tell us the story of something like a Shazam,
Yeah.
okay? And you were, the founding investor, you've been involved in nurturing the founders and really shaping that, etc. How did it come to you and how did you say, I like this group versus I'm sure 20 other things that come your way?
For sure, for sure. So this was an interesting story. I mean, this would have been in roughly 2000, I guess, where a guy called Chris Barton, sitting in California, in San Francisco, in fact, suddenly had this idea of, wouldn't it be cool to recognize music on a mobile phone? This was when mobile phones in the US hadn't really taken off at all. I mean, which is amazing to think, just even 20 years ago, people didn't really use mobile phones. And he then went to a series of people saying, hey, wouldn't this be cool? And everybody kind of said, look, this is really hard to do. It can't really be done. But they pointed him in the direction of a professor at Stanford, who was the professor of audio acoustics at Stanford. And he went, and Chris went to see him. And this guy said, look, I don't think it can be done. The technology it's too difficult. But if somebody could do it, here are 4 PhD students of mine who might be able to crack it. So Chris went and spoke to all of them. All of them said, can't be done. So Chris said, fine, okay, that's it. I'm going to go on and do something else. And then 6 months later, one of them phoned him up, a guy called Avery Wang, and said, I've cracked it. And he had actually built this algorithm for how this could be done. So Chris, Avery, and 2 other guys got together and said, well, why don't we form a business out of this? And they said, let's do this in Europe, because Europe has much higher mobile phone penetration than the UK does. So they came to Europe, and then they got introduced to me by a common friend. So they came in and said, listen, we've got this cool tech. And they kind of demoed it to me. And of course, it didn't work. But I just loved the passion, and I love music. And I just felt, oh my God, I just want to see this work. So we kind of put in the initial investment. I became the chairman of the company and really helped nurture it and so on and so forth. But ultimately, one of the most important things is luck. Right. So Shazam started in roughly 2000. There was no iPhone there. It was all, touch-tone phones. And it almost went bust so many times. And finally, at one point, we had to sell all of the intellectual property to keep it going, because we discovered that, in addition to recognizing the song, it could be used in a B2B context. So we went to a company called BMI, whose job it is to pay artists royalties based on what's played on the radio. And at that point, literally, they would have people listening to the radio and writing down what was played. And that's how Madonna got paid. So we said, look, we can automate this whole thing for you. So we sold them the IP and the money, and we kept the B2C rights. They had the B2B rights. And that money then kept us going a little bit longer. And then finally, it was pure luck that the iPhone came along, and Apple decided that Shazam was going to be one of the core apps they were going to promote. And one favorite email that I've still got somewhere is to a guy called Eddie Q, who used to run the iPhone at the time. And it just goes, what is this Shazam thing, SJ, from Steve Jobs to Eddie Q? And then once Apple got behind it and the iPhone got behind it, then everything just took off. But even then, there were various times we used to make our money by selling the songs. You tag a song and then buy it. That's how we made our money. But then Spotify came along and nobody was buying songs anymore. And suddenly our entire business model collapsed. And, Shazam again had to pivot. So it's never easy. And luck is a major part of what we do. And finally, this had a happy ending because Apple ended up buying it. But it was a pretty long journey.
And also, I think this is where, business acumen of people like you and the other people on the board comes in handy to be able to have that meeting with Apple. It's like certain right connections have to be made. It doesn't happen. And also when you're down, to be able to say, okay, let's do B2B and keep the B2C. These are all very business decisions. These are not creative decisions, right? I think that's where...
I'd say they're both. There's some element of creative. I mean, Shazam was a very creative company.
It is.
So I would say we're doing both. Apple, of course, is an incredibly creative company. So
right. Yeah. So that leads to my next question of, when you start a company, and especially even doesn't matter in the area of art or business or whatever, there is a point at which, do I do this on my own, or do I become part of a larger studio, or do I sell the IP to somebody else? I mean, even in your case, when you did Seatwave, you sold it to Ticketmaster and Shazam to Apple. And, in every company's or every existence, the question comes, do I do this on my own, which is an IPO kind of a thing, or do I sell to someone? So there's a quicker impact, much larger, quicker impact. So were you part of those conversations, and how do you make a decision between, this is sort of like, do I do it alone versus join a record label versus, IPO versus selling. So tell me a little bit of your thought process on that.
It's a tough one because it's very rare you're the only one making the decision. You've got investors who've got their own agendas. You have, who have their own ways they want to do things. And then it all comes down to risk appetite, in my view. It all comes down to how risk averse are you and how much risk are you prepared to take and what do you really want to do? So if you're Mark Zuckerberg, who has a Facebook, and you want to, when he started it, really change the world, and say, I will be able to do this on my own, as opposed to if I'm part of Microsoft or if I'm part of somebody else, that takes a certain type of individual who says, I really want to do this and I really want to change the world. There's another type of entrepreneur who's very, very good at taking things to a certain level, but then they're not a particularly good manager. So if they're then making the decision of where do I go with this, and they've got advisors from the investor side, et cetera, advising them, they have to decide what is best for the company, not what is necessarily best for me. And I think those are some of the hardest decisions some entrepreneurs have to take, which is when they realize, it's a bit like being the director of the play and realizing I'm not in control of this thing anymore. When an entrepreneur maybe realizes I'm not necessarily the right person to take this thing to the next level. So what is my role now? And what do I do now? And they can go in 2 or 3 different directions. You can say, okay, I'm going to sell the company now because frankly, the next person can do something much bigger with it than I can. Or you can say, I'm going to step back and take a different role and let someone else run it. But these are all very individual decisions. And as I said, your investors have a huge part to play in these decisions as well, because they've got their own agendas about what they want. So there is no one answer to this. I think every situation is somewhat different. And ultimately, I think entrepreneurs have to just, trust their instincts, but also always think about what is right for my people and what is right for the company. You've had too many examples recently, whether it's Uber or WeWork and so on and so forth, where the superstar entrepreneurs, Theranos is the most recent one, obviously, in the news, where the superstar entrepreneurs weren't necessarily thinking about the good for the customer or the good for the company. And it really became about themselves. Then that's where I think the real problems come.
Yeah. And that's also the, hero worship we have developed, in general in this world of, we make people heroes and then we are disappointed in every little thing. I mean, we see this. By the way, I keep thinking of Shazam, like they should have gone to India because the cell phone usage was much higher than anyone else.
That is true. That is true. I mean, India is one of Shazam's biggest markets. I mean, so, a massive database of Indian music.
Correct. Yeah. My next question is about really getting into the mind of someone else, because empathy, it's about really understanding the other person when you're sitting across to, even while you're pitching your product, you have to see in what way is it good for them. Now, as an author, you wrote Aisha and the Firefish, and this is, with your background, one would have expected a business book or something of that sort. And here is a book about it, young adult, a girl hero. Like, first of all, how did this idea come? And secondly, how did you get into the mind of a young teenage girl?
Well, I had 2 young teenage girls at the time, so that was helpful. I mean, the way the idea came up was I used to read my daughters bedtime stories every night, as everybody does. And then occasionally I would make up stories for them. And the story of Aisha, I just started making it up one night. And the next night they said, oh, tell us what happened next and what happened next. And then over a week or 2 weeks, I was just making up new bits of this story and suddenly thought, actually, that's quite a nice little story. Why don't I write it down? So I kind of wrote it down. And this would have been when they were 7 or 8. And then I probably didn't do anything for another 7, 8 years. It was just there somewhere. And then my wife told me, why don't you write that story you've always been telling me about? So I said, well, why not? So I wrote it out, and then in sheer luck, a friend of mine, I showed it to a friend of mine, a guy called Salil Tripathi, who said, oh, I've got an editor in Penguin, in Puffin Books. They might be interested in having a look. And I sent it to them, and sheer luck again, they said, well, this is nice, we'll publish it. So, I mean, unfortunately, publishing is not that easy. So how do you get into their mind? So the first thing I wanted to do was when I was reading my daughters the bedtime stories, there were very few heroines who looked like them.
Right.
So I was absolutely keen to have, I mean, there are many more now, but this would have been, I don't know, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, look, I just want to write a really nice book with an Indian girl as a heroine and an Indian girl who saves the world. Why not? So that's kind of why I did it in the first place. And then, as I said, when I was doing the final writing, they were both teenagers by then. So yeah, so getting into their minds uh,
Yeah.
was certainly a possibility. But the same thing happened when I wrote my new book, The Waiter, which is
Right.
about a Muslim detective from Calcutta.
Hmm.
I've lived in Calcutta, but I'm not Muslim, nor have I been a detective. But it just intrigued me about what happens if a disgraced Muslim detective from Calcutta is working in a restaurant in the East End of London as a waiter, and he has to solve crimes. And it just gets very interesting getting into all of that. One of the things I'm really not keen on is the debates about cultural appropriation, this, that, and the other.
Right. Yeah.
My personal view is, if you want to write about something, you can write about it well and authentically. You should be allowed to.
Yeah.
So that's kind of
Yeah.
where I come from.
Sure. So we're coming toward the end of the interview. So I want to ask a couple of personal questions, Ajay. So, what is it in your background you think that has helped you become who you are? Is it the fact that you lived in a certain place, certain teacher you had, or this combination of creative and business together, or did you watch one of your parents being that way, or just tell me from your education, from your training, where did this thing come from?
An interesting question. I mean, I've always been passionate about music and literature growing up. I was reading all the time, all kinds of things. Obviously, in India, growing up, it's all Enid Blyton and Agatha Christie and P.G. Wodehouse. I still read Agatha Christie and P.G. Wodehouse, not so much Enid Blyton now.
Yeah.
So I read all the time growing up in India, and my parents really encouraged the reading. I loved music, and when I finished school, I really wanted to go and study English literature. And my dad came home one day and said, "Okay, I've enrolled you in an economics college, and you're going to do economics in Bombay." So I said, "Oh, well, all right then." And so I just kind of fell into the business world
Mhm.
as it was. Then when I finished college, I was lucky enough to be able to go to business school in the US, and it was more that I wanted to go to the US than I wanted to go to business school. But then I discovered I was pretty good at business, and I came to the UK and started working with Bain, the management consultancy. And when I turned 30, I had this massive epiphany of, oh my God, do I want to be an artist or do I want to be in business? So I quit my job, went to drama school, absolutely loved it, did a 1 year course, but realized by then I'd gotten used to a certain lifestyle that was
Yeah.
going to make it more difficult to do the drama school. So I thought I'll just keep doing it on the side.
Mhm.
So it was just really passion. Started with the art side, and then I kind of fell into the business side and realized, well, I'm actually not bad at both of them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's an important thing. A lot of times when you make your passion your profession, it also compromises a lot of things. And if you
Sure.
can make both of them your passion, like that
Exactly.
would be the best way. And it shouldn't feel like, oh my God, I got to do this business to support that. But you enjoy both, then I think that's the
Exactly.
best of the world.
Exactly.
So, one more personal question for you. You meet like some of the most coolest people. I mean, like you're in the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts, so you sit next to somebody like a Helen Mirren, and then you meet all kinds of business people, etc. So, my last question to you is, who's someone who left you in awe? And it's hard to pick one, maybe one or two people. I mean, from who you really felt you learned, and what did you learn from them?
Oh gosh. It's probably my teacher at drama school, actually. So when I quit my, I told you when I was 30, I quit my job, and the guy running my course was a guy called George Roman. And George was, sadly, he passed away. Was a Hungarian refugee who left Hungary in 1956, which is very apposite now, given everything that's happening in Ukraine, when the Russians came in, and came to the UK with nothing, not speaking a word of English. He and his wife made a very difficult trip to come to the UK, came here, worked for, I think, the coal board was the only job he could get, but then made it as one of the best theater directors in the country. He became artistic director at various theaters in the country. And I saw a bunch of his plays, and he produced some of the most wonderful theater I have ever seen. And he was one of the wisest, funniest, warmest people I know. And he'd had a really, really tough life. And George is the person that I'll always think back on and think somebody who could have gone through that and come out at the other end, being a brilliant artist, but also being one of the most warmest, most generous people. He's the godfather to my daughter. It's just fantastic. And you see people like that and you go, they're so incredibly special. Yes, you can have met a lot of, famous people, etc., wonderful. But someone like that just sticks with you. And he's the person I think about the most when, as I said, he passed away a few years ago. He was tremendous.
Yeah, so that's
I
good.
did a great interview on YouTube.
Yeah,
there's a great interview I've done with him where he's discussing one of his productions of Midsummer Night's Dream. So I'm really glad we've got that.
That's great. So I want to end up by saying we both have been influenced by Hungarians. I've been influenced by Andy Grove, and you with
all right. Yeah, absolutely.
George, and wonderful to meet you and learn so much. And then, as I wrap up, I just want to say that being an artrepreneur is a journey, and it's not easy. And I think it's constantly balancing what's important for you personally versus the platform. And may you all entrepreneurs that are out there find the strength and the fun that comes with it to be great at what you do. And thanks, Ajay, for your time, because we've all learned a lot.
Thanks so much, Lakshmi. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.